Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi untuk semua Bapak Ibu, rekan-rekan, kolega, peserta, partisipan. Eh, Terima kasih sudah hadir. Kita akan memulai public lecture dari Dr. Sophie Chao dari Universitas of Sydney dengan judul Against Extractivism, Multispecies Justice in Beyond Bios World. Acara dari public lecture ini diselenggarakan atas kerjasama Departemen Antropologi, Deconstruction Indonesia, dan Logos ID. Pertama-tama mungkin saya ingin menjelaskan beberapa hal untuk membuka ini. Saya di sini Imam Ardianto, Ketua Departemen Antropologi Universitas Indonesia. Saya akan memandu dan menjadi host dalam acara public lecture ini. Pertama-tama saya terima kasih untuk Sophie untuk kesediaan waktu dan pemberian kesempatan ke kita untuk memberikan public lecture di hari ini. Alasan dari kami mengundang Sophie di sini adalah sebagai bagian dari upaya Departemen Antropologi untuk merespon dua hal. Pertama, eh, mencoba membangun persahabatan dan juga eh, membangun jaringan ya untuk mempelajari satu tema yang sedang juga didalami oleh departemen kami secara kolektif, yaitu mengenai eh, isu ekstraktivism dan juga sebetulnya dengan isu-isu lingkungan yang sebetulnya di departemen kami memiliki tradisi dan sejarah yang cukup panjang sejak awal berdirinya Departemen Antropologi di Universitas Indonesia. Terlepas dengan berbagai orientasi paradigma teoritik dan juga public engagement-nya, antropologi di Universitas Indonesia telah eh, mempublikasikan dan juga telah membangun ya berbagai pendekatan yang mengulas persoalan-persoalan hubungan antara bagaimana komunitas berinteraksi dengan ruang hidup dan bagaimana komunitas juga berinteraksi dengan ruang hidup dalam kaitannya dengan kedatangan negara dan juga kedatangan dari ekspansi kapitalisme, perkebunan, dan ekstraktif industri. Dan ini sudah berlangsung cukup lama, dimulai tentu dengan awal mula dari proyek Pakuncaraningrat sendiri di Papua, dan juga di berbagai tempat dalam program-program pembangunan. Bukunya yang sangat terkenal, Rintangan Mental Pembangunan, itu menjadi salah satu buku yang memang menjadi karya yang merespon dan juga berinteraksi dengan negara di periode yang lalu dalam konteks transisi awal dari ekspansi perubahan dan proyek demografi seperti transmigrasi dan juga pemunculan industri ekstraktif secara lebih luas seperti perkebunan, kehutanan dan juga tambang sejak era 60-an hingga 70-an. Dan antropologi ada di situ dan sejak tahun 80-an akhir berkembang dan bercabang dari segi orientasi dan tujuan di mana sebagian generasi antropologi mulai menggunakan pendekatan-pendekatan yang berbeda dengan melihat tidak hanya antropologi bersama negara, tapi menulis studi mengenai hubungan manusia dan lingkungan dalam konteks melihat bagaimana negara melakukan dominasi di berbagai tempat. Di antaranya di awal mulai oleh almarhum Dr. Iwan Citra. Saya pikir saya harus menyebutkan di sini Dr. Iwan Citra Jaya dan bersamaan dengan Ibu Yunita Winarto yang telah mempublikasikan dan berinteraksi dengan berbagai orang dalam mengarus utamakan hak-hak komunitas dan juga awal mula membicarakan masyarakat adat dan bentuk-bentuk respon etnografi yang engage dengan kebutuhan komunitas. Jadi dua paradigma mulai di situ yaitu human ecology dan juga contextualization progresif dari ala Andrew Faida yang memang mendidik Dr. Iwan Citra dan juga Ibu Yunita. Dan persis di akhir 90-an kita kedatangan Ibu Suraya Afif ya dan tahun 2000-an Departemen antropologi juga diperkenalkan dengan paradigma baru, engagement yang baru mengenai bagaimana interaksi antara komunitas, negara dan dalam isu ekstraktivism ya. Itu isu konservasi, isu apa? Isu eh, tambang dan juga isu yang lain. Dan politik ekologi menjadi salah satu trademark dan benchmark Departemen Antropologi Universitas Indonesia semenjak Ibu Soraya mengampu perkuliahan dan mengisi dan membentuk dan mempengaruhi bagaimana antropologi di Universitas Indonesia dan juga mungkin kalau tidak bisa kalau saya mau klaim perkembangan dan percakapan peran antropologi dalam berbicara mengenai ekstraktivisme di Indonesia. Dan dengan alasan itu pula lah saya mengundang Sophie untuk bisa memberikan kuliah dan ceramah hari ini yang akan mampu memperkaya dan memberikan kami penyegaran dan paradigma dan perspektif yang baru sebagai titik mula lainnya dalam membicarakan hal yang telah dipelajari dan dipublikasikan oleh Departemen Antropologi selama 30 tahun terakhir. Itu saya pikir rasionalnya dan dalam konteks ini juga kami sebetulnya senang sekali bisa berhubungan dengan Sophie dan melalui event ini karena di kami juga sudah mulai bermunculan emerging younger scholars yang mulai mengeksplorasi isu-isu yang berkenaan dengan modern human anthropology, isu extractivism. Di sini kita baru join juga di departemen kita 3 tahun terakhir, Geger Yanto, Sofian Ansori, begitu juga emerging scholars yang akan kami proyeksikan terlibat di dalam departemen kami seperti Rivaldo, Ignacia Ridapser, dan termasuk Alberta Christine yang saya terima kasih sekali memungkinkan acara ini bisa terjadi dengan menghubungkan kami dengan Sophie. Jadi memang itu part dari institutional plan dan development dari departemen kita, tapi sekaligus bagian dari upaya membangun simpul-simpul ya untuk melakukan upaya kritik terhadap ekstraktivism dan juga isu-isu dalam multispecies justice ke depan. Dan mungkin kepada para penonton dari lecture ini, izinkan saya memperkenalkan Sophie dan Dr. Sophie Chao merupakan senior lecturer di University of Sydney. Eh, Dia dikenal melalui publikasi pertamanya yang eh, menjelaskan mengenai topik mengenai palm oil di Papua dan etnografinya mengenai multispecies justice di Indonesia dan di Papua terutama dan etnografinya betul-betul memberikan eh, pintu masuk dalam memahami dan melihat isu multispecies sebagai topik baru dalam environmental humanities dan juga sebagai topik yang menjadi eh, pintu masuk pembuka dalam melihat persoalan-persoalan dari implikasi perubahan lingkungan yang dramatis di Papua. Dia juga baru saja mempublikasikan, saya tidak bisa melis semuanya karena begitu banyak, tapi salah satu buku terakhirnya adalah eh, isu mengenai more than bios, jadi mulai masuk mengeksplorasi tidak hanya isu multispecies dan isu the studi mengenai critical life studies misalnya ya, tapi juga mempelajari aspek-aspek mengenai benda, batu, mineral, bumi, dan hal yang lebih luas. Dan hal tersebut akan disampaikan oleh Sophie dalam dalam lecture ini. Eh, dan teman-teman partisipan bisa membaca biografinya secara utuh di websitenya More Than Human Anthropology untuk mengetahui semua publikasi detailnya, tapi saya cukup perkenalkan di situ topik-topik yang sudah dipelajari Sophie berkenaan dengan multispecies justice, More Than Human Anthropology, Pacific Anthropology, dan tema-tema lainnya. Nah, saya meminta maaf bagi yang berbahasa Inggris di sini untuk saya buka ini dalam bahasa Indonesia karena memang forumnya memang untuk audiens Indonesia. Jadi ini part dari decolonizing juga. Jadi kami minta maaf, tapi nanti rekamannya bisa direkam dan silakan transkrip melalui YouTube dengan teknologi AI yang lebih memudahkan sekarang. Jadi eh, jadi mungkin demikian ini dari saya awal untuk menjelaskan konteks dari perkuliahan ini dan harapan dari kami sebagai departemen kepada Sophie juga kepada penonton mengenai public lecture dan public talk ini. Ke depan nanti akan ada presentasi dari Sophie selama 35 menit. Next, lalu di kesempatan ini kami senang sekali mengundang kolega teman kami dari Monash University, Perdana Roswaldi atau biasa dipanggil Mbak Pepe, untuk bisa hadir sebagai diskusan. Ini juga bagian dari kami berusaha menjadi rumah yang inklusif, yang tidak terlalu inward looking dan insular, untuk bisa membuka ya wawasan dan wacana. Mbak Pepe baru menyelesaikan disertasinya mengenai palm oil, dekat juga dengan isu ekstraktif, dan mempublikasikan hal-hal yang kurang lebih serupa. Jadi kami berharap sekali juga nanti Mbak Pepe akan memberikan diskusi pasca lecture-nya Sophie selama 20 menit, dan kemudian nanti akan ada respon Sophie dan saya akan membuka kesempatan untuk Q&A sesudah itu. Jadi sekitar 60 menit lagi Bapak Ibu memiliki kesempatan untuk saya bacakan pertanyaannya jika itu chat, dan saya akan berikan waktunya untuk mengajukan pertanyaan dan komentar secara langsung. Tapi saya minta maaf mungkin nanti hanya 2 sampai 3 penanya. Jadi begitu kurang lebih acaranya. Tanpa mengambil banyak waktu lagi, saya berjanji hanya 10 menit, mudah-mudahan saya tidak kelebihan. Tanpa banyak memotong waktu lagi, kita sambut Dr. Sophie Chao untuk public talk-nya. Sophie, waktu dan tempatnya, the screen is yours. Silakan Sophie.
Terima kasih banyak, Pak Imam. Saya share screen dulu. Oke. Teman-teman bisa lihat PowerPoint saya? Sudah ya? Oke. Okay, thank you so much, Pa Iman, for that wonderful introduction, for giving us the bigger context for this public lecture in the history and genealogy of critical thinking within UI's Department of Anthropology. I want to thank the department, I want to thank Deconstructing Indonesia, and I want to thank Logos ID for inviting me to deliver this public talk. Particular gratitude goes to Imam, to Bu Suraya, to Alberta Cristina, and to Maria Rosari Amadea for all the organization and the planning that have made today's online talk possible. I also want to thank Pepe for joining somewhat last minute as a discussant. I'm very grateful for your time and your presence. And I want to thank everybody who is joining us online today for this conversation, particularly any students and early career researchers and scholars in the room, and hopefully not just anthropologists, although I imagine that is most of the audience, but also scholars working in related disciplines. I'm looking forward to a lively Q&A, and also if there are activists or NGO members in this audience, yeah, very glad to have you here and keen to be in dialogue. So the context of this public talk, as Imam explained, is a focus on extractivism, on multi-species justice, and on the urgency of more than human anthropology. In this time of growing ecological crisis, of rapid technological change, and of enduring social inequality, this program and this theme offered to us all a really vital opportunity to reflect collectively on what it means to be human through our everyday and deep time entanglements with always already more than human worlds. And I am very grateful for the invitation to be part of this collective reflection, both through today's public lecture and also through the multi-species masterclass and book launch events that will be happening later this week. In the spirit of global South and North collaborative thinking, it's also a real gift to be part of a space that is working towards decolonizing a discipline that some might argue can never be fully decolonized. I believe the hope for that endeavor lies precisely in these spaces of conversation. And so yeah, thrilled to be here. I also hope that this public lecture will be the first of many more collaborations and conversations to come. So I'm coming to this talk as an environmental anthropologist and a multi-species studies scholar. And most of my research in the last 10 years or so has focused on trying to understand the intersections of ecology, plantation capitalism, indigeneity, health, and justice in the Pacific region. Much of this research draws on my long-term ethnographic fieldwork and participant observation among Indigenous marine communities in the West Papuan Regency of Merauke, whom I've had the great privilege to think with and to learn from over the last decade, and indeed long before that in my prior career as a human rights advocate. Much of my research also draws on sustained interdisciplinary collaborations with scholars of human environment relations from fields including anthropology, but also Indigenous studies, critical race studies, human geography, feminist studies, Pacific studies, and science and technology studies. And many of these collaborators are named here on my opening slide because I think it's very important to point out and to remember that none of this thinking and writing happens in a silo. None of it happens individually. All of it is the result of co-production of knowledge, co-thinking with scholars, and all of the communities and geographies that these scholars speak for and with, and in some ways come to represent. So, in today's public lecture, I will not be focusing specifically on my research in Indonesia or in West Papua. If anybody is interested to hear more about that, there is a book launch happening on Friday, also in hybrid mode, where I will be talking about hunger and gender and ecology in Merauke. So please come to that. In today's talk, I'm going to draw on two of my ongoing interdisciplinary research collaborations to think about the contours of justice for what I'm calling beyond human and beyond bios beings in a world of unevenly distributed extractivism, violence, and vulnerability. In reflecting on the challenges, but also the opportunities involved in enacting what has come to be known as multi-species justice, or that is to say, a form of justice that takes non-humans as its subjects, I'm going to try to draw our attention not only to beyond human beings like plants, animals, and microbes, but also to beyond bios beings, such as soil, water, mountains, and spirits. Those forms of matter or materiality that might not be considered to be alive in a biological or a secular scientific sense, but that, as I'll try to argue, must also be accounted for in our attempts to theorize and enact justice beyond the human. In doing so, I want to invite us all to ask ourselves and others, what forms of justice do these beyond bios and beyond human subjects demand of us? How can a multi-species justice framework reconcile the needs of more than human beings whilst also remaining very attentive to injustices against humans who are themselves deemed subhuman or non-human and therefore killable before the law? How does a beyond bias approach offer us new ways of thinking about the very distinction between what is life and what is non-life, as well as their historical and contemporary relationship to the question of justice? So, my own interest in multi-species justice arose during my fieldwork among Marind, an indigenous people of West Papua whose intimate and ancestral relationships to the forest ecology and its more than human dwellers and kin have been radically undermined in the last decade as a result of mass deforestation and the expansion of industrial oil palm and other agribusiness plantations. What became clear to me in the course of this fieldwork was that Marind did not conceptualize rights, responsibilities, or even indeed the law as a human-only phenomenon, both in terms of its objects and in terms of its subjects. Social justice was to many of my friends in the field inseparable from environmental justice, because the well-being of plants, animals, elements, and ecosystems was seen to be integral to the well-being of human communities, and vice versa. The very notion that nature and culture existed as separate domains was alien to many of my companions, who actually very much saw themselves as belonging to the land and bound to the laws of the land, rather than the opposite. Relationships, relationality, these were the key operative terms in marine philosophies and practices and protocols of more than human coexistence, as indeed they are for indigenous peoples across the world. Marine have no word in their own language for what we in English might call environment or nature. Rather, they often spoke of the entities who compose what we might call the environment or nature through the language of kinship, of shared ancestry, of intergenerational bonds, and of agentive, sentient communities of life. Marine ways of knowing and relating to the more than human world brought up a range of difficult questions that stayed with me long after I left the field. What kind of legal and institutional transformations, I wondered, might be needed to genuinely recognize non-humans as subjects of justice? How can we, as anthropologists, reconcile different epistemologies of nature in achieving justice for non-humans? How can we expand the scope of justice to encompass non-humans whilst also remaining sensitive to the lives of those humans who are deemed disposable and killable before the law? And in what ways do justice paradigms today and to come demand recognition and reckoning of injustices wrought by much longer histories and pasts of colonial violence and extraction? These and other related questions lie at the heart of the emergent field of multi-species justice, a field that is trying to reconceptualize justice beyond the human realm and to consider its implications for the ideological, cultural, ethical, political, and structural transformation of existing justice institutions. Central to this emerging current is an acknowledgement that dominant existing frameworks for imagining justice, the ways it is represented, and the way it is delivered, are simply not up to the task and not fit for purpose when it comes to attending to the multiple dimensions of injustice in a multi-species world. More specifically, the individualistic and the anthropocentric ontologies that underpin virtually all theories and practices of justice in Western legal cultures are proving sorely inadequate to encompass and recognize the needs, the relations, the interests, the communicative styles, and the life ways and life worlds of non-humans as members of a diverse yet shared community of life. So the transformative work of creating multi-species justice requires new kinds of political imaginaries. Imaginaries that are able to take into account the radical diversity of ways of being, the complexity of multi-species relations, and also, importantly, the impossibility of achieving full knowability, full translation, and full communication across multi-species worlds, even as we try to craft shared spaces for reaching closer towards more just arrangements and more just outcomes. Just as the multi in multi-species demands a kind of more than multidisciplinary approach, so too theorizing justice beyond the human invites a multidisciplinary cross-pollination of theories, of practices, and of methods. And this is precisely what my collaborators and I, within the Promise of Multispecies Justice project, attempted to do during the height of the 2020 pandemic summer, when we assembled an international crew in a Zoom room to share stories with glimmers of hope for people and for creatures who are united across vast geographical divides by their shared experiences of violence, of extractivism, of dispossession, and of loss. And this project culminated in an edited volume, the cover of which is featured on this image. The contributors to this project included scholars in anthropology, in Indigenous studies, in environmental justice, in post-colonial studies, in theology, in political theory, in STS, in feminist theory, in philosophy, and also less conventional producers of knowledge, including activists, poets, science fiction writers, and artists and architects. Just as important as these human thinkers were the many non-human protagonists who animated the project. Pesticides, viruses, oil palms, stray dogs, nuclear waste, rodents, prison gardens, and many more. In thinking with these non-human beings, we sought in the project to track the contours of justice as it travels from courtrooms to protest movements in the streets, from the abstract realms of high theory to the fleeting domain of ghosts, ancestors, and spirits. In Micronesia, for instance, we were drawn to indigenous practices for celebrating the beauty of an endangered bird, the kingfisher, with its green, orange, and white feathers. Even as in this same geography, colonial enterprises continue to produce extinction and draw on extraction. In the prisons of California, we looked at food gardens that are offering us glimpses of beauty within a deeply flawed justice system, conjuring possibilities for a multi-species prison abolition movement to gain ground and grow. In the Colombian Amazon, meanwhile, we learned about inter-ethnic conflict and land-based extractivism that continue, even as at the same time, dreams and laws are proliferating about justice for nature itself as a victim of war. In these and many other geographic settings, we collectively asked, how does expanding the scope and the subject of justice beyond the human and beyond the law invite new possibilities for decolonizing not just multi-species relations, but also the very concept and practice of justice itself? Expectedly, if perhaps for some disappointingly, this project does not offer an exhaustive or prescriptive or definitive concept of multi-species justice. In fact, the horizons of justice that are represented in the collection are often themselves in generative friction with one another. Some of our contributors call for justice through everyday acts of care, others through radical, sweeping structural reforms, yet others through multinational and transgeographic forms of revolution, and yet others through micro-biopolitical modes of bettering rather than necessarily ending interspecies conflicts. What many of us try to do in this project is actually to attend critically to the situatedness and partiality of justice as a contextual practice across different sites, different subjects, and different scales. This attention to situatedness and specificity resonates with literary studies scholar Ursula Heise's very first formulation of multi-species justices, note here in the plural, as, quote, the question of what is and is not right to do by other people and species, on what grounds, and how to proceed when our ideas of justice diverge. At the same time, it is very important when we try to theorize multi-species justice to remember that not all human people are themselves treated as fully human before the law. Colonial constructs of race and nature continue to haunt the cultural politics of identity as terrains of power that operate both within and across species lines. Some species and some kinds of people continue to be vulnerable to premature death or even targeted for extermination. As open violence is directed at people on account of their blackness, their brownness, their disability, or their queerness, slower forms of violence are incrementally and often imperceptibly disabling and debilitating vulnerable humans and vulnerable species. In this context, multi-species justice involves seizing opportunities for intersectional political practice. Intersectionality, of course, has classically been used as an analytical framework to understand how social and political identities combine to create different lived experiences of discrimination and of privilege. For us in this project, ideas about intersectional inequality involving humans and non-humans have most productively been explored in the context of a patchy Anthropocene, where concerns are simultaneously people-focused and also engage with multi-species entanglements. Patchiness, as Anna Singh writes, is, quote, justice's condition of possibility and its limit at the same time. Patchiness, she continues, operates on the acute awareness of our own limitations, working here in a register of contingency and failure rather than one of heroic action or totalizing mastery over either reality or knowledge, end quote. In an allied spirit, we in the Multispecies Justice Project are interested in patches of justice that survive and thrive amidst uneven conditions of extractivism and livability. But what, after all, is a life? And what is alive? As I've explored in the first half of this talk, multi-species justice is very much premised on a radical reimagining of all living beings as the premise in turn for recognition of non-humans as subjects of justice. But what happens when we think about worlds of matter and mattering beyond conventional categories and boundaries of scientific frameworks, including biology and species? What might it mean to imagine and engage with worlds, with beings, and with justice, not just beyond human and multi-species, but also beyond bios or more than species? In thinking with justice beyond the category of bios as life, the second project I want to speak to today, titled Worlds Beyond Bios, and forthcoming as an edited volume in August of this year, joins a growing chorus of voices that are pushing against epistemologies anchored in the rigid divisions and hierarchies between human and non-human, animate and inanimate, and living and non-living. In challenging these often naturalized and taken for granted distinctions, the collaborators on this project examine material entanglements by thinking with a spectrum of substances and beings that fall outside the bounds of life as understood in terms of biology and the bios or zoe divide. These beyond bios beings include rocks, soil, sludge, dust, spirits, mountains, water, and more. They are forms of matter that might not or might no longer be considered life in the dominant scientific sense of the word, bios. But they too, we try to uncover, bear legible cultural, social, and political existences. They too can become subject to extraction, control, and mastery. They too can experience and embody harm, violence, and vulnerability. They too, in other words, constitute emerging, processual, and transforming entities, or what the anthropologist Tim Ingold calls, quote, the material embodiment of a certain way of being alive, end quote, one that is more than biology as currently envisioned. In the Worlds Beyond Bios project, we travel through industrial oil palm plantations in rural Indonesia, through sewage treatment plants in urbanized Singapore, and through dust-filled borderlands in the India-Bangladesh frontier. We journey to the pastoralist landscapes of the Mongolian plateau, the sacred lakes of highland Bhutan, and the sentient forests of the Ecuadorian Amazon. Along the way, readers will pause at the foot of towering mountains in Argentina and linger in the outback deserts of Australia. Together, we unearth deep coal pasts in the post-industrial landscapes of the Ruhr Valley in Germany. We follow the global supply chain of an electric toaster, and we encounter pulp and paper extractions and experiments in the United States Pacific Northwest. Our guides in this endeavor include sand and spirits, water and waste, rocks and wreckage, coal and carcasses, fire and forests, mermaids and monsters, ropes and rockets, and sonars and sludge. Our project here is trying to story with, rather than just about or for, these diversely situated beyond bios beings, uncovering in the process how their participation in and how their disruptions of anthropocentric and biocentric orderings of the political are in fact critical to the continuance of life as we know it. In attending to worlds beyond bios, this project aims to argue that in order to perceive, to engage, and to do justice to current climate and environmental catastrophes, it is absolutely imperative that we try to undo the normative binary of life and non-life. That binary that has in many ways ordered priorities in the political economy and beyond. We thus aim to expand recent calls for an anthropology of life, Pache Eduardo Cohn, to an anthropology of being, moving here from a politics of life to a politics of relating that recognizes material existence or matter as transcending and troubling what life understood as just species or organisms can encompass, a study of life as bios, but not only, in the words of Marisol de la Cadena. We do this because we believe that a beyond bias approach can help us ask different questions about the worlds that we inherit, and transmit. For instance, what kinds of earthly matter matters? How is the world in this matter? And how is this matter in the world? What is life when matter can die, when matter can heal, when matter can be mourned, and when matter can be reborn? How does one, as a scholar and anthropologist, story this matter and its myriad mutations? And what forms of coexistence might be enabled by collectively reimagining more capacious, more critical, more creative, and more caring relationships to matter in friction and to matter in flux? In this project, we examine worlds beyond bias through the lens of four different kinds of materiality. The first of these is eco-materialities, which brings into the fold diverse elements and forces that sustain ecosystemic life and more than bios earthly relations, from sand, weather, and oceans to mountains, fire, and stones. The second of our conceptual lens is technomaterialities, here encompassing the substances, the skills, the crafts, and the processes that are involved in the making and doing of planetary matter in movement, including but not limited to human and industrial interventions. I'm thinking here of the arts of rope weaving and waste sorting, to the mass production of manufactured toasters, but also to the life-giving labors of nourishing soils and river waters. The third of our entry points is cosmomaterialities, which centers sacred or otherwise more than metaphysical entities, entities who straddle that line between the material and the immaterial, and the immanent and the transcendent. Spirits, for instance, ancestors, monsters, spectrals, and ghouls. Finally, material afterlives invites us to consider the forms and effects of those kinds of matter that may no longer or never in fact have been alive, but that remain nonetheless lively, as dead life, or non-life, or zombie life, if also haunting and spectral. I'm thinking here about animal corpses, roadkill, pulped trees, polluted soils, recycled sludge, and dust particulates. The cross-cutting kind of catalytic valences of these four themes that I've just outlined are also evidenced in the project by a number of key conceptual insights that run across and run through the volume's multiple chapters. Central among these is our attention to how matter comes to matter as and in its relationships, or relational materialities. These relations include relations between matter and human and more than human dwellers and denizens, relationships to spatio-temporal points of origin and dispersion, relations to formal and everyday institutions and infrastructures, relations to supply chains and legal and regulatory mechanisms, to colonial capitalist regimes, technologies, and imaginaries. The primary unit of analysis and engagement here is not matter independently, but matter through its mattering relations between different kinds of substances, processes, forces, and frictions, all of which we argue make matter possible, political, and also plural. A second cross-cutting theme in this collection is that of temporal materialities, referring here to time, to memory, and to history as kind of bright red threads that combine throughout the weave of this work. Thinking with rock and water's permanence, for instance, helps us reposition human societies as fleeting microcosms within the much longer durée of geological time or deep time, a kind of time that long predates the flourishing of biological life itself. Some of our thinking here comes also from waste and from dust, that are expressions of material ongoingness, forms of matter that hold the stakes of the past and also shape the stakes of the future, surviving in the memories of laborers and of residents, but also in the memory of ground, of soil, and of river. Across these and other contexts, matter's permanence or ongoingness works hand in hand with its transformability as it encounters other kinds of bodies and other kinds of forces. A third methodological or conceptual strand in this project focuses on how intimate and sensory relationships with matter are what often generate our situated and shifting socio-material and ethical sensitivities, or what we call sensory materiality. Practices that we explore that are anchored in a kind of embodied bodily engagement and distributed performativity, such as composting books, singing to spirits, nurturing soils, cleaning up waste, or seeing one's body catch fire, bring to the fore how corporeal or bodily relationalities and ecological intimacies with matter are what reveal both mastery over matter, companionship with matter, complicity with matter, vulnerability to matter, and other kinds of entanglements within beyond bios worlds. In doing so, these accounts of sensory materialities center humans as situated both in and amongst, rather than detached or above, the material worlds and flows of sensory and bodily awareness within which ideas about worlds beyond bios take shape and then shapeshift. Not surprisingly, climate change and environmental crises constitute a prominent backdrop for many of the beyond bios epistemologies and praxeologies examined in our project. These crises manifest in multiple forms, from the corpses of plastic-filled birds to the contaminated skin of ocean bodies, to the burns suffered by human and non-human victims of climate change-induced forest fires, to the destruction of sacred Aboriginal rock formations by multinational mining companies, to the 50 billion tons of sand extracted annually for construction purposes, to the substitution of ancient forests for pulp and paper and oil palm operations, to the extractive industries claiming control over both subterranean resources and racialized bodies, to the extreme droughts and floods that have now become the rhythm and the refrain of our times. Finally, several collaborators in this project approach material beyond bios worlds through the lens of multi-being justice. And this shift here from multi-species, of course, speaks to the fact that multi-being justice is trying to make space for beings who are not recognized as species, who are not recognized as biological, but that we argue also merit and fair treatment and recognition before the law and in everyday life. Now, these formulations bring into being or bring into ethical and moral purview humans and non-humans as forms of being, but also flesh, atmosphere, time, and the diverse environments that enable biotic life to survive and thrive. The lithosphere, the hydrosphere, the anthroposphere, the cryosphere, the biosphere, the atmosphere. This formulation of multi-being justice emphasizes conditions, expressions, vulnerabilities and relationships of ontological being beyond the categories and hierarchies of biology as life, beyond the organization of life to the ends of profit, and beyond the colonial logics of individuated ownership and property. They invite, in other words, a reframing of justice not as an abstract ideal or principle, but rather, in the words of Karen Barad, as, quote, a material set of impossibilities within and of the world, involving interactive space-time matterings that account for devastation wrought by colonial racial capitalism, but also for possible histories and futures through which beyond bios living together might not only endure, but also potentially flourish. Now, having introduced these two projects to you, I want to take a step back and look around us in this moment. When we look around, when we take inventory or take stock of the contemporary conditions that we inhabit, it is very easy to slip into a paralyzing feeling of despair. We live, after all, in an era of self-consuming capitalist growth, with the expansion of capitalist markets undermining the very conditions of life on Earth. Atmospheric conditions are shifting, making it increasingly difficult for us all to breathe. Industrial processes are uncoupling or separating life from death and diminishing death's capacity to channel vitality back to the living. Against this dire backdrop of extraction, extinction, and precarity, what might it mean to imagine a field of justice where multiple species circulate, where the household is in dynamic equilibrium with interlocking ecological systems and economic circuits? Within this field, I want to argue justice is always going to be slippery and it's always going to be spectral. It shifts and it morphs across time, space, and species, resisting institutional capture and human mastery. This is a kind of justice that exerts an unpredictable force in the world, through momentous events, through everyday moments, and through provisional judgments. It is a kind of justice that demands that we not just think beyond the human, but also stay very close to the forms of violence, extraction, and dehumanization that continue to plague human communities across the world. It is a kind of justice that demands that we also acknowledge the limits of our own abilities as humans to fully understand, comprehend, let alone represent the worlds of beyond bios beings. And it is a form of justice that also exhorts us to stay very wary of the risk of potentially flattening our understanding of agency and of power by approaching the world in multi-species and beyond bios terms. What I think we need in this space, then, perhaps more than anything, perhaps more than laws, perhaps more than regulations, perhaps more than policies, are stories. Stories of multi-species justice that are able to jump across scales and across domains, moving from abstract speculation to situated political action and material intervention, and then back again. Stories that explore tactics for achieving multi-species justice in situations where calculations will never be perfect and will always be open to contestation and reinterpretation. Stories that ask us to ask deeper questions about what, how, and by whom laws and languages in any land are composed. Stories that offer an approach to justice that is anchored in a practice of being open and being alive to the generative possibilities of each and every encounter with the more than human world. Stories that demand that we decide together what dreams we think are worth dreaming in this age of extraction and extinction, and by extension, which injustices we deem to be unacceptable and intolerable. Remember here that stories are also invitations. Invitations to renew our commitment to love, to live, and to fight together for the possibility of flourishing in beyond bios worlds, both present and to come. To invite, as the etymology of the English word suggests, is to extend an invitation. But to invite is also to summon, to incite, and to challenge. To invite, question who gets to invite or be invited, on what grounds. and to what ends. To invite calls on us to reimagine the human, the beyond bios, and justice itself through perhaps a different kind of ethic. One that is not tied to ideas of individualism or anthropocentrism or possession or occupation or appropriation, but perhaps an ethic that is animated by a different kind of philosophy, by a shared bodily, intergenerational, and multi being ourness or togetherness. A togetherness that I would like to argue composes and will allow to survive both the life of matter and this matter that is life. Thank you so much. Terima kasih.
Makasih, Sophie. Yeah, really fascinating and intriguing presentations. Ya, untuk kesempatan berikutnya, saya ingin mengundang kawan kita PP untuk bisa memberikan respon, memberikan diskusi, memberikan pertanyaan atas ide dan presentasi dari Sophie. Silakan, Mbak PP.
Oh boy. um, Sophie, thank you. Thank you so much for these two provocations. I don't have like a structured and systematized response, but whenever let me start with an acknowledgement as someone who was born and raised in a palm oil plantations myself. When the first time I heard about the multi-species justice, of course, I was one of the group of scholars and people who get a little bit skeptical at first, especially in that time. It was happening during the kerfuffle that follows after the Donna Haraway's interview about in which she defines plantations as like a slavery of ants, and of course, so many Black geographers also do not take that very lightly, and. But I'm glad that the multi-species justice, at least from the introductions of the edited volume and your book In the Shadow of a Palm and your explanation today, clearly aims to respond to the critiques that the Black geographers have done before, and basically in how to attend to like the human injustice as well that comes simultaneously with the injustice against the non-human beings as well. And one story that particularly makes me rethink everything about multi-species justice as I understood before, and in addition to your project, of course, is the case of in 2009 in Ngare, Nairobi, in Tanzania. The world of conservation was shaken to the core because at that time, a herd of elephants was driven to the cliff to their death by the indigenous people in Ngare. And for a sociologist like me, the complexity is quite clear, of course, the impoverishments and whatnot. But if we refer to Fanon's questioning the kind of human projects, and of course taken up by Sylvia Winter later, what kind of human being, what is this human project that stands on the death of elephants, for example? What kind of human projects, what does it tell us about our existential being and standing if we serve and pose ourselves as those who stand on the death of like the ecosystem, basically the king of the ashes. And I think multi-species justice, then I try to rethink this as an attempt to answer the master and slave dialectics that has been in the classical questions in many anti-colonial philosophy, but also the kind of form of attending, using the words by Simone Weil, at the purest and the most generous form that tries to defy the relations of capital, the one that is governing our relationship right now. So the first thing that I realized is that this attending is very much the kind of question that multi-species justice would like to bring to the forefront. And again, using the word to collectively imagine and the reconciliations and the co-materiality, because the exchange value, the market exchange as a capital relations makes us to see ore, for example, not as just like an entity, but it's an entity that is waiting to be transformed into a speculative spreadsheet at the Wall Street or the Composite Stock Price Index in Indonesia. So attending to this metabolic shift, not just like calling it as a relationship, but actually try to foregrounding it as a material relation. So I would like to see it's more than just like the call of like, oh, this is a new material thing, new materialism, but it's actually an attempt to rematerialize this relationship that has been concealed before. So I think it's very much also at the core of anti-capitalist critique in understanding the commodity fetishism, for example. The fact that like so many idea, even including the well-meaning idea like conservation, for example, tends to commodify the elephants themselves, for example. So the multi-species justice aims to unravel that kind of extractive relationship and try to understand and take up the pattern from Sylvia Winter to ask what kind of new human that we're trying to envision when we try to defy and if not collectively reject the exchange value, the use value regime that is imposed by capitalism and other types of matrices of oppression, such as colonialism. So it's in the reflections of that kind of value regime, because the iron rule of the market is the absence of consequences or the prohibition to even think and reflect on such consequences. We don't really think about, say, if as a sociologist, again, bringing back to the horrible cases of an indigenous group, the kind of group that we tend to romanticize as someone as the harbinger of the climate justice is capable of killing and leading to the death of these elephants, trying to think maybe it's not just a question of impoverishment, but what kind of relationship that leads to the collective decision that let's kill these elephants to their death. And impoverishment by ways of capitalism, by ways of conservation capitalism is an easy story to tell. But of course, multi-species justice forces us to engage in complexity, but the kind of complexity that may not just like be a cold calculations of matrices of oppressions, but also the one of complexity that forces us to also rethink our standing in ecosystem. So it's not just like understanding the relationship, but also trying to understand the complicity, using your word as well, in this attempt to unravel the capitalist relationship that has been concealed upon us. And I like to imagine the multi-species justice is very gently, but also very forcibly trying to manifest what Fred Moten. I really enjoy reading the edited poem that you have, because like you quote a lot of Fred Moten. I really love Fred Moten, in which he said in one of the interviewed on Eflux that I don't need your help. I just need you to recognize that this shit is killing you too. However much more softly, you stupid motherfucker. I basically think that when if there's any failure in understanding the shared recognition with the elephants, with the bios, with the minerals, it's less so much about that we have to understand what the minerals are saying, because according to Indonesian philosopher Saras Dewi in ecophenomenology, we do not need that kind of like a full understanding, the kind of full similar languages to understand that the same relation is killing us both, and we don't need to be the kind of so multi-species justice basically tries gently reminds everyone, like, let's not pretend that we understand what the trees are saying. We don't have to pretend that we speak the same language with indigeneity, for example, but it's more about like, what can you do in the shared complexity and to lead to the shared recognitions. But of course, shared recognitions, again, according to Fred Moten and of course Fanon, is not like an easy, it's not an easy and like it's not an easy and automatic processes, especially the kind of like this oppressive systems such as colonialism and capitalism, for example, impedes and delays that process of shared recognitions. And that's why multi-species justice, this is, I think, the reason why you always emphasize that this is not this is not a call for like making a legal code for for like interspecies justice. Of course, there's like some research, I think like an edited volume about the legal personhood or habeas corpus that acknowledges like the standing of river, for example. But even for that, I think like under multi-species justice, for example, you will like to if you can also criticize that what does it mean to have a legal personhood if our current legal system is basically a property is based on proprietorship, making something to be a part of like the exchange value, making something like a movable object, which is exactly what multi-species justice has been trying to tell people. Let's not do that. But of course, a couple of like reflections about multi-species justice, and possibly for those who are interested in taking the multi-species justice further, is to think through how like the patchiness that Donna Haraway says is also corresponds to the greater system. For example, at least in my research, like under plantation capitalism, this patchiness of injustice is very much built to like the whole systems that's built all together. So of course, the questions for the multi-species justice is like not to how do you say it? Not to conflict the trees from the forest, for example, because of course like sometimes we often are quite happy or like very sufficiently happy. We're like, okay, small things like this, but the small things, small winning, however much is important, means like also a new signal for like these matrices of oppression to respond and shift again, because again the shape shifting is not only for the interspecies but also the very oppression systems that the multi-species justice is trying to answer and like to combating. So because at the end of the day, still like capitalism and capitalism, racism, including like patriarchy, isn't still an order of rule. It's not the anarchy of rule as one would like to define capitalism or neoliberalism, for example. But they still have the order of rule in which this patchiness of injustice also correspond and create and are very much constitutive to the whole system. So and bringing back again to the metabolic shift, I think there's who's the author who writes the Plantation World? So it's like the study of like the small Indian smallholders and the elephant in India. Basically attending to this because this is also methodology, I believe. It's a methodological invitation, trying to like this metabolic ethnography, the way Aaron calls it. So to trying to understand this metabolic shift from this patchiness, so we can truly rematerialize it in the larger scale. So one of the example of work that I think that has successfully done this by Bren Kauf and in which he studies the rise, the relationship between the rise of financializations and the rise of pathogens and the anti-insects, like how the construction of pests and insects. So I think it's a very fascinating work in the sense that, wow, this is exactly what the multi-species justice, I think, is trying to also bridge between this patchiness and the whole system of it all, of the whole matrices of oppression. So attending to these little things and build up to the constitutive that constitute the whole system of injustice. Because I think multi-species justice, I think, is one of the framework that is quite explicit about attending to the scale. But of course, scale also operates to scale bending and scale jumping. This is the kind of thing that we always have to be mindful of when we're engaged to this kind of method, to this new form of methodology, to actually try to understand and foreground the co-materiality that you have described before. Sorry, I have like so many notes. So I'm sorry I didn't see because like it is not systematic, so I'm very sorry. Yeah, and I think like I already mentioned about the rematerializing. Yes, the contemporary. So I have like 4 general points that I think I have already talked about. Yes, and I think like the last one the last point that I would like to make is when I again like to reflect upon the multi-species justice as a methodology as well, and like what kind of thing that it could lead us to, it reminds me of Mokhtar Lubis' novel Harimau Harimau or Tiger Tiger. Usually people talk about the novel as an allegory against Sukarno, but the presence of man-eating tiger in the novel actually unsettles the gum tapers group and social cohesion. Yet the tiger and the unruly Sumatran rainforest do not stop as a parable, but the death of tiger and also the death equals to the unclear conclusion on the moral and political and social failure that has been thematically looming the book. So I also don't want people to take the multi-species justice like a woo woo scientific inquiries in which just like tending to spirituality, but it's more about like this kind of separations between what material and immaterial could no longer hold under the climate crisis, and precisely this separation what brings us to this premature death, to this kind of politics that looms our quest towards climate justice. And I think this is like a huge it's a good invitation to think about like again the human project as a whole, and to actually think like what does it mean for a human being again, if to human exceptionalism, if our exceptionalism stands on the brink of ashes, and the death of like the elephants, like the fact that our human being can only triumph after we kill a man-eating tiger. So what does it mean to our climate justice? Because if you think about it, multi-species justice forces us to see how paradoxical it is that, for example, again bringing back to the conservation case, what does it mean to allow what do you call it, like the hunting season, for example, in so many Eastern African conservation programs, for example, some visitors are allowed to kill tigers or to kill lions. So, but for like $400,000. So, what does it mean to pay $400,000 to make sure the ecosystem's running? But again, it's one that is built upon death after death, and then in the long run, again, however much more softly, it ends up killing us too. Just like Fred Moten said. I think that's all I can say, and I'm very sorry if it's just like a little bit here and there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pepe. Wow, so many things. And ya, mungkin saya sebagai host memberikan kesempatan dulu untuk Sophie, lalu juga mungkin saya akan sedikit merespons, sekaligus juga mencerna perlahan-lahan begitu banyak keyword explanations yang fascinating, yang membuka perdebatan dengan berbagai topics gitu ya. Dan mungkin saya beri kesempatan dulu untuk Sophie untuk bisa merespons PP dengan I think there is a four general comments, but ya, silakan Sophie.
Yeah. Oh wow. Oh boy. I'm saying it back to you, Pepe. That was amazing. And I'm so glad that we are recording this session so I can revisit everything you've just said and let it sink in properly. That was so rich. I just put a link in the chat. Which is actually a new book that came out just last week. Very short book, but it's very much connected to Pepe's initial avowal of skepticism about multi-species justice. And this book is about plantations and trying to think about multi-species justice in the context of that particular kind of anthropogenic formation, and trying to address some of the critiques of multi-species justice that Pepe was gesturing to at the opening of her comment. And it's free for download until the end of this week, I think. So I'm going to take as much as I can of your incredible gift of a commentary there, Pepe. It's really interesting. You started by talking about the skepticism about multi-species justice, and I mean honestly, I think that skepticism is a very healthy thing, and the skepticism and pushback against multi-species justice in its kind of early iterations was absolutely warranted, for a number of different reasons. Multi-species justice might be new as an academic sort of concept and field, but it is anything but new in the space of critical race studies, in Indigenous life worlds. So there's a real, there are some very strong ethical and political stakes here in terms of who we are considering to be part of this conversation, how we need to be very wary of newness and novelty when it is built on the invisibilization of long-standing genealogies and canons and practices. At the same time, it's very interesting because when I use the term multi-species, I always include the human in multi-species. We are also a species. So in some ways, you could argue that multi-species doesn't have to exclude the human. On the contrary, it allows us to rethink ourselves within a much broader spectrum of life. But maybe people don't think about humans when they think multi-species because maybe we don't like to think about ourselves as a species. We're communities and we're cultures or peoples. But I think that says something quite interesting about who is and isn't human. And yeah, it's a human exceptionalism, absolutely. I think for me, multi-species justice also raises some really big questions that remain, ongoingly discussed and debated as to who gets to speak for the non-human if we are truly arguing that non-humans have rights and deserve fairness, who gets to represent their interests on what grounds and so forth. The premise for me is always that knowledge of the more than human world is mediated by our own bodily abilities, affordances, capacities, and that they are always going to be limited. So this question of who gets to speak for, with, or against non-humans is something that I think many of us are still trying to figure out. And I think part of yeah, you also, pointed out this challenge or danger of materialistic thinking as also sort of purporting to be offering something new, when in fact there is no new materialism. There is only renewed materialisms, because materialism has, again, not just been a theory for many peoples around the world for, since time immemorial, not just theory, but also praxis, right? This is not just stuff that people um, intellectualize, it's things that people live by. And one scholar who's really helped me in that thinking is the Maori scholar Brendan Hokofitu, who put out a very strong critique of new materialism and rephrased it as renewed in brackets to gesture to indigenous philosophies. And at the same time, you very importantly pointed out the equal danger of essentializing or romanticizing indigenous knowledges and epistemologies of the more than human world. And one scholar, again, who helps me with that, helps me temper that danger of essentializing actually indigenous life worlds is Liana Chua, who works, of course, on orangutan conservation, and brings out some very interesting politics around human wildlife relationships that do not always, in fact, very rarely harmonize with conservation ideologies, sort of, ways of representing endangered species as kind of mascots or icons of conservation. And I think for me, the bigger picture as well is that. Yeah, this danger of romanticizing often arises from the ways in which relationality is misinterpreted as necessarily relationality is a kind of key principle or concept in many indigenous life worlds, but that does not mean that all relations are good or life-sustaining or beneficial. Capitalism is a relation.
Yes.
Colonization is a relation. Enslavement is a relation, right? So the fact that not all relations are good, and this is not my point, this is the point made by Kim Tallbear, a Native American scholar, is really, really important to hold on to because it helps us avoid the risk and actually the very, a risk that is materializing in all kinds of ways of multi-species scholarship sort of becoming kind of shrouded in this beautiful aura of beneficial, life-sustaining coexistence and multi-species care, which of course is something I imagine we want to strive towards, but that is not always or necessarily beneficial to all beings involved. So just because we are in relation does not mean that all relations are good. And our job as anthropologists and multi-species scholars, as you do so beautifully, Pepe, is to unpack the complexity of the relation and not just kind of take it for granted as the beginning and the end point of the conversation. It's where we start, but it takes us to much more interesting and much more messy places. Um, I want to pick up also on your point about kind of institutionalizing multi-species justice. There's this field, this emerging current. very interdisciplinary, and it's also people are very much in disagreement, even within the current, about what multi-species justice is, who gets to decide that, and this question of whether it has to always be situated and partial and patchy, as anthropologists like ourselves would like to argue, or whether there is in fact a set of basic principles that might actually work across scales and at a kind of more global or universal level, right? Can this practice be institutionalized in a way that travels across very, very different field sites? Or is the attempt to institutionalize MSJ, in fact, kind of going back to Audre Lorde's, the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. By trying to turn justice into laws and regulatory frameworks and policies, we're actually still trying to fit justice within these kinds of dominant colonial frameworks of justice, right? So there's a big tension there. And I think I am the kind of person who is a little bit skeptical of institutionalizing anything because then it gets so easily co-opted and becomes hegemonic in a different kind of way, and then results in justice once again being monopolized by the same kinds of actors. Multi-species human justice, all of it can lend itself so quickly to capture and to co-optation. And at the same time, this volume that we published on multi-species justice, it got a lot of criticism, a lot of pushback because we refused to offer a kind of universal definition of multi-species justice or a universal kind of set of tools and methods to actually implement this. And many respondents or reviewers were really kind of like pissed off that it was super theoretical and ethnographic, but it wasn't practical, it wasn't actionable, and I completely agree with them. And I'm seeing a question in the chat as I'm saying this from Ellis or about what it would mean to seriously do this stuff in the world, and that is still a huge question mark for me. But I think it's a question that cannot be answered just by anthropologists. It has to be answered with NGOs, with conservation scientists, with biologists, with politicians, with every single stakeholder or member of this kind of world that we inhabit. Interestingly, some of the biggest pushback we got from the volume was from animal rights activists. And this is a whole other space that yeah, the vegan movement, right? So kind of positions where no killing can ever be good, right? There is no such thing as a good death for a non-human species. My work takes a much more, I guess I don't want to say nuanced because that sounds very dismissive, but because it's based on ethnography, the sort of idea of what is a good death, a bad death, what or who is killable in multi-species worlds, I really ground in the perspective of the people whom I work with in West Papua. But that's another perspective that I think needs to be brought into the fold, right? Can there ever be a good death for an animal, for instance, or a plant for that matter, and who gets to make that call and on what basis? So the question of justice and killability for me is a big one. And it harks back to your examples about the elephants as well, right? In your commentary. Um, Another big question that comes up for me, and I'm so glad that you brought it up, Pepe, was the question of scale. I guess two ways of thinking about scale for me. First is the scale of the problem that we're facing with the climate crisis, and relatedly, the problem of scale, right? That givenness of the scale of anything, whether it's the cell, the organism, the individual, the collective, the regional, the national, the planetary. These are all scales that we as anthropologists try to work with, but also travel across in our thinking. We try to recognize that no scale is ever kind of clearly bounded or delimited or contoured, right? That they are very fuzzy on the edges. And that also scale, Anna's things work on the problem of neat scalability, right? That there is no neat way of scaling something from the cellular to the planetary because everything is, context starts to shape things differently at each jump across the scale. So the scale of the problem and the problem of scale for me is something I would love to do more thinking with. And I think scale when it comes to multi-species justice is really, really critical. Think, for instance, about, I was critical of individualistic kind of paradigms of justice, right? Where the subject of justice is an individual. For animal rights activists, actually, the individual animal is what matters, right? The suffering of one animal is crucial to their form of advocacy and justice seeking. It's not about the species, it's about that dog, that cat, that livestock, right? So individualism also needs to sort of be taken in its own context in some ways. And then we think about in the Australian context, for instance, there's a lot of debate around multi-species justice for invasive species who are undermining native ecologies, right? Introduced cane toads, introduced rabbits, introduced donkeys, and so forth. They are actively killed because they are jeopardizing pre-existing ecologies. But of course, they are then also subjects of what you could argue is injustice, right? They didn't choose to be here. They didn't choose to be transported to the New World. So how do we think about the scale of justice also in those kinds of native, non-native, introduced and invasive contexts? And can killing individual organisms to sustain broader ecosystems ever be warranted, I guess, is a big question for me in relationship to scale. I want to close with some responses to your point about multi-species justice as methodology, which I think is a really wonderful invitation, a really wonderful provocation, Pepe. Um, how does it change what we do as anthropologists or multi-species scholars? I think it inflects our methodologies in a number of different ways. The first for me is that doing fieldwork and trying to think through interspecies relationships through the lens of justice actually demands maybe more from us than thinking through the lens of care. So care is another very prevalent kind of analytic or conceptual framing in multi-species study, multi-species care. For me, justice actually it confronts us with some more difficult questions. So, for instance, I shouldn't have to care for or love a cockroach in order to think seriously about what it means for that cockroach to live a just life, right? It's not about how I feel about it. It's about what it needs to survive and to thrive and how its survival and thriving can be aligned with the survival and thriving of other beings, including but not limited to myself. So justice actually maybe asks a bit more from us than care. It demands that we confront unloved and sometimes unlovable others in ways that are not actually about love, but that are about what's the right thing to do in this situation. The second way I think multi-species justice might be a really productive methodology is that going back to those wonderful quotes you shared from Walton, is that it invites us to situate violence and extractivism in specific situated moments within a much broader landscape of what Judith Butler calls a common corporeal vulnerability, right? That it's killing us too, as you quoted, and that if we start to think about violence and injustice through a much longer temporal framework, and that we too become vulnerable. We too suffer the harms enacted by colonial capitalist racial frameworks that position both humans and non-humans as sources of profit and as sources of extraction, right? It's just not happening all in the same time frame. And I think that acknowledgement of a common corporeal vulnerability is very powerful also because it invites us to think about, what kind of ancestors do we then become? How will we be remembered by people in the future, right? How do we want to be, recognized and commemorated for the things we have or haven't done to further or not further multi-species justice? And I think the third way in which multi-species justice perhaps can act as a productive methodology is that it really makes us have to ask different questions about positionality. And so it's something that all of us do in our work. It's something that's been with us since the 1960s, at least in anthropology, since the crisis of representation. So certainly not new, but perhaps slightly different kinds of stakes here. Positionality here in relation to the non-human as a subject, as an interagent. Positionality through when we do fieldwork, for instance, instance, the very things, the very foods we eat, and the plants and animals from whom those foods derive. Positionality in terms of what it means when we come home from our field sites, for me, back to Sydney, for instance, and how we continue to be part of and complicit in chains of killing and extraction in faraway places through the commodities that we purchase and consume and through the things that make our everyday life possible, all of which are grounded in, extractive frontiers and out of the way places. So I feel like there's a way in which positionality and accountability and impurity also take on a different kind of energy and ethic when we think about our field work and our field sites through the lens of multi-species justice. So I'm very happy to hear your pushback on those things as well. And the last thing I wanted to do is to share, a couple of scholars again who, for me, have been really helpful in engaging with this really difficult terrain of the relationship between race, species, and culture. And there are three critical race studies thinkers who really, really accompany me in this work of theorizing multi-species justice, because so much of their scholarship is about trying to uncover how, in fact, some of the forms of violence and harm and injustice that enslave marginalized human communities face are actually grounded in the very same logics that perpetuate the enslavement of non-human beings. So Joshua Bennett, for instance, wrote a fabulous book called On Being Property Once Myself, in which he looks at the relationship between animals and humans in plantations during the colonial period and unearths all kinds of unexpected solidarities and resistances between species in the face of the plantation as an extractive racializing assemblage, sorry. The other scholar who helps me with this thinking is Bénédicte Boisseron and her book Afro Dog, which again is not about trying to challenge multi-species thinking by drawing attention to human violence, but in fact trying to show how multi-species justice thinking can actually also help further the agendas of racial justice and social justice by positioning them within a much broader landscape of injustices that affect humans and non-humans differently, of course, but always togetherly across space and time. And the third scholar I want to acknowledge is Tiffany Lethabo King and her amazing book Black Shawls, and the chapter on indigo plantations specifically, which is about this absolutely poignant and poetic and political chapter about women enslaved workers in indigo colonial plantations and the way in which their manual bodily labors and engagements with indigo plants and indigo dyes and the sharing of the dye between the plant that kind of seeps into their fingers and their limbs and their exhausted bodies creates a kind of shared mattering, right? Forged in the face of the unthinkable violence of the plantation system, a way in which human and plant flesh actually become one, with both parties positioned as objects of extraction and fungible flesh under the sort of colonial system. So, wanting to end with those three amazing thinkers in the hope that perhaps some of you in the room might go and check out their incredible work. But I'm so grateful for your commentary, Pepe. It's all given me so much food to think with, and yeah, I feel like we need to write something together that is both challenging and injecting multi-species justice with all of these really important ethical and political and also affective stakes. So terima kasih banyak, Pepe.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Sophie.
Sophie.
Okay, yeah, we already have questions, but sebelum kita ke question, ternyata saya doang yang bicara Indonesia ya. Pertanyaannya pun bahasa Inggris semua. Jadi, tapi oke, sebelum pelan-pelan menuju pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang terdapat di dalam chat yang memang berasal dari publik ya, beberapa adalah associate fellow kita, tapi beberapa juga merupakan partisipan yang ikut di dalam percakapan ini. Mungkin sedikit juga merespon ya sebagai host juga sebagai Department of Anthropology apa yang tadi sudah disampaikan oleh Sophie dan juga direspon oleh PP memang kurang lebih menjadi perhatian dan juga concern dari departemen kita, dan we are struggling and grappling with it as well. Jadi kita juga mengeksplorasi, saya juga mungkin perlu acknowledge dan mungkin juga bagian dari agar publik dan penonton untuk mengetahui dan juga ikut terlibat nanti jika sekiranya kita bisa berkolaborasi tidak hanya Sophie dengan kami dalam konteks the issues of justice and multispecies studies. Memang ada beberapa hal yang setidaknya saya selaku sebagai chair dalam konteks pengembangan dan arah keilmuan ke depan beresonansi ya, keterkaitan antara apa yang telah disampaikan Sophie dan juga apa yang direspon oleh PP berkenaan dengan multispecies justice. Sebelum saya nanti masuk ke isu extractivism, salah satunya memang kita sudah memiliki publikasi sebetulnya dari kolega kita, sayang dia tidak bisa hadir hari ini, Dr. Prihandoko, yang menulis mengenai isu multispecies etnografi juga, tapi tentu dengan latar belakang dan background keilmuan yang berbeda, yang menulis etnografinya di Cilacap mengenai kemunculan tanah timbul, jadi land generating issues di mangrove. Dan salah satunya juga dari kolega kita Rino Arifiansah yang menulis mengenai brown brown hopper ya, belalang wereng coklat ya. Jadi kemunculan emerging emerging wereng coklat di Jawa dan kemunculan dia sebagai elite pest. So sebagai hama elit di lanskap agroekosistem sawah, dan juga beberapa kajian-kajian lainnya dari associate fellow kita seperti Sunjaya yang sudah meneliti dan mengengage studi-studi mengenai coastal dan juga multispecies dan berdialog dengan disiplin konservasi mengenai what is multispecies ethnography and what is multispecies justice kalau kemudian kita mau elaborasi. Dan beberapa di antaranya saya lihat menarik dielaborasi terutama dalam pertanyaan PP mengenai methodology in terms of, we don't need to know about how forest think. Jadi ada beberapa langkah yang muncul dan berkembang dalam dua arah di departemen kami. Pertama memang berangkat dari STS ataupun dari Latourian approach, yaitu Rino memang ditrain oleh Latour di Paris waktu itu, dan Rino memang menggunakan science as a translation. Jadi dia menggunakan itu sebagai sebuah metodologi dalam memahami bagaimana juga melihat relationality yang transform di dalam berabad-abad revolusi hijau di Pulau Jawa. Tapi on the other hand, there is a several also colleague here, di beberapa rekan kita di sini juga mulai, termasuk saya yang sedang mengeksplorasi juga dari angles yang sedikit berbeda, yang justru mengeksplorasi isu yang disebut oleh banyak tulisan termasuk Della Cadena dan Paul Blaser mengenai cosmopolitics, terutama untuk mengeksplorasi pula isu mengenai spirits and more than human subject, dan membicarakan human dalam hierarki dan spektrum. Dan memang semua pertanyaan dan questionsnya how to study this kind of thing gitu. Jadi percakapan tadi thought provoking dan membuat kita setidaknya memahami beberapa keyword. Salah satunya adalah aspek berkaitan dengan what is relation and what relationality. Eh, di situ kita lagi mencoba mengelaborasi, bagi Ibu Soraya yang besar dalam tradisi political ecology, the term justice is more appealing karena it's more make sense to talk the relevance of this methodology gitu. But di satu sisi ada juga beberapa framework yang ingin mengelaborasi mengenai pusparagam ya, a spectrum of diverse way of being and living in Indonesia. Bagi beberapa orang ini dikritik karena erat kaitannya dengan the way of essentializing and romanticizing ontology, romanticizing cosmology and everything. Setidaknya saya bersama salah satu beberapa mahasiswa saya studi saya di Sumatera mengenai political frontiers, mengeksplorasi melihat bahwa emerging relations in terms of dan lain-lain juga muncul berbarengan dengan colonial legacy gitu. Jadi sepertinya hal-hal yang tadi disampaikan sangat fruitful dengan kita karena memang percakapan mengenai kontribusi dari colonialism and capitalism in the last 2 century di Indonesia dengan ragam bentuk frontiers yang berbeda melahirkan cara eh, berhubungan dan dinamika yang berbeda dengan more than human subject dan di situ saya lihat kontribusi gitu ya dari apa yang telah disampaikan Sophie dan PP. Jadi it's really really interesting and fascinating questions. Nah, saya juga ingin lanjut berikutnya ke isu ekstraktivismnya, sesuatu yang sepertinya belum terlalu elaborate more. Dan sepertinya di sini ada Mas Geger sebelum nanti kita masuk ke dalam questions untuk memberikan short respon jika memang ada respon. Tapi jika tidak, kita bisa go on. Mana Mas Geger Yanto adalah salah satu staff di kita yang memang sedang mendalami isu ekstraktivism dan kira-kira apa relevansi to talk about multispecies justice di frontiers di Weda, di Morowali dan semua yang telah dikunjungi Mas Geger. Mas Geger silakan kalau jika memang ada respons.
Okay, it's a bit of spontaneous, so I don't prepare anything for this response. And I think I would like to prefer speaking in Indonesian before translating it to English if it's possible. Uh, saya sendiri melakukan riset tentang itu kegiatan yang sangat lekat dengan ekstraktivisme di Indonesia dan khususnya sebetulnya terkait dengan nikel, dan kita tahu bahwa nikel is a sector that is being pushed right now in Indonesia, and it creates what scholars call the zone of sacrifice all over the places. I mean in the central Sulawesi and also in the northern Maluku. It creates a kind of devastation to the landscape and pre-existing relationship between people and those certain plot of land. But on the other hand, it's interesting to also see that even though when we're talking about these extraction projects, it always like put human that is living on these sites as if I can quote keyboard Geertz as mosquitoes, it's like Geertz pernah pada satu waktu bilang bahwa orang-orang yang tinggal di tempat-tempat di luar Jawa dan itu menjadi tempat untuk perkebunan, mereka dianggap sebagai nyamuk saja. They are being considered only as mosquitoes, either by the government, by the colonial government, and also by the plantations, the enterprises themselves. And I can also say that on extractions, in regard to extraction projects, even though we can also like complicate the phases, there are phases, ada fase di mana project-project di masa lalu itu sangat memperlakukan manusia sebagai benar-benar nyamuk, dan sekarang mereka juga harus tetap mereka kini harus berhadapan dengan rezim safeguarding yang lebih kompleks dan juga rezim finansial yang sekarang sangat berkutat dengan berbagai tentu saja safeguard gitu kan. Tapi tetap saja saya melihat bahwa ada kecenderungan kalau dari sisi capital dan juga dari sisi ya mungkin to a certain extent the state kecenderungan untuk melihat local relations as something that is uh, mirip dengan can be compared with mosquitoes. But on the other hand, there's also an interesting point that we can also emphasize in these extractive sites, and this that there are interspecies. I don't know if we can call it that. Ada hubungan gitu di antara apa namanya lokal antara locals gitu yang sudah disposes, dan di sana itu mereka mengalami perubahan yang sangat signifikan dari kehidupan mereka pada saat itu dalam katakanlah 5 tahun terakhir, 10 tahun terakhir, 20 tahun terakhir, mereka tiba-tiba dari sebelumnya mereka fokus pada agriculture and also fishing, tiba-tiba mereka berubah sama sekali ke sekarang mereka harus menawarkan jasa gitu kan. They're changing their focus of livelihood from the service from agriculture and fishing sectors to servicing and accommodating those incoming workers from everywhere around Indonesia. Dan pada saat ini kita bisa lihat juga bahwa ada satu stagnasi di mana mereka ya Jadi sangat bergantung pada itu dan kita nggak bisa semata-mata bilang bahwa kita mengadvokasi sebuah satu bentuk justice bila kita benar-benar katakanlah mendorong ya satu bentuk transisi gitu, total gitu. Mereka di stop sama sekali penghidupan yang udah bergantung pada juga kalau mau kita bilangnya tambang gitu. Dan mereka harus katakanlah hidup benar-benar sekarang kembali ke nature gitu. Jadi what I want to say is when we're talking about extractivism, especially in regards to mining, we are also seeing that this kind of projects create a kind of dependence between people and their a new kind of dependence between people and their landscapes, the indigenous, the people who are living and having a existing relationship with their landscapes. It's transformed their this kind of relationships and creating a kind of dependence that I think also create a kind of bisa dibilang ya kalau kita pun katakanlah mengadvokasi satu bentuk relasi yang lain tanpa memperhitungkan bahwa mereka sudah bergantung dengan itu, kita ya membawa satu bentuk katakanlah ya kekejaman dan brutalitas yang lain gitu. Artinya saya cuma mungkin itu ya nggak bisa memberikan sesuatu yang sangat sistematik. Saya cuma mau mungkin memperlihatkan bahwa ya kita juga melihat satu bentuk relasi-relasi yang ya mungkin tadi juga Sophie sempat bicarakan gitu emerging relationships that kind of ya muncul mengikuti apa namanya mengikuti munculnya mode-mode baru ini. Dan satu lagi tadi terkait scales, when Sophie mentioned scales, there's also an interesting point that we can also emphasize that people when they're focusing on extraction projects somewhere, it also creates a kind of effect in the other places. There's some kind of multi-local effects when we're talking, for instance, the projects in North Maluku. It creates a kind of like a pull effect for the population around this surrounding neighbor areas. Orang-orang dari Maluku Tengah, orang-orang dari Papua yang sebelumnya mereka akan karena mereka sudah sangat atun dengan apa namanya pola kehidupan yang apa namanya sangat-sangat apa namanya mereka sudah atun dengan ekspektasi bahwa mereka harus anaknya sekolah, anaknya berkuliah, kemudian yang apa namanya karena state projects ini menanamkan kepada mereka mereka idealnya nanti ketika mereka sudah dewasa mereka menjadi pegawai gajian gitu. Mereka pun juga punya ekspektasi akan mendapatkan uang cash dan itu sebetulnya menciptakan di banyak smaller islands in Indonesia, smaller archipelagos in Indonesia kecenderungan untuk ya membuka hutan untuk tanaman komoditas, something that Tania Lee would design it as the capitalism from below. Jadi commodities are uh, proliferating, commodities crops are proliferating through people who are expecting and aspiring to have a better life, and they can and to like send their children to school and create actually another problem that they create a kind of surplus educated population. Tapi ya maksudnya faktanya juga seperti itu bahwa kita melihat ada berbagai scale gitu dan ketika ada satu project besar gitu di satu tempat di Indonesia, di tempat lain orang-orang jadi apa namanya cenderung membiarkan kebun-kebun itu jadi nggak berkembang, nggak dikelola lagi atau mereka nggak membuka hutan baru dan ya sebagai akibatnya kita melihat ya semacam proliferating effects in uh, neighboring regions gitu, di mana ya misalkan ada tempat-tempat hutan-hutan yang kita expect mereka akan dibuka gitu sebelumnya jadi lebih intact gitu. Jadi uh, ya mungkin respon ini sangat nggak sistematis, tapi
Iya, iya, Ger.
mau menyampaikan itu. Mungkin itu
Ger,
Imam.
aku ingin melanjutkan Geger untuk kembali ke Sophie dan mengaitkannya dengan dua pertanyaan yang ada di chat yang sepertinya berhubungan. Mudah-mudahan saya tidak terlalu memaksakan ya. But in the way what Geger just mentioned before, the regime of social safeguard human rights, right-based standard, performance standard. Jadi ketika masyarakat sipil dan saintis mampu mengadvocate issue of justice dalam energy transitions, dalam extractive industry, dalam donor and grant di semua tempat di Indonesia. The question is not just about issue of justice berkaitan dengan bagaimana ekstraksi itu memberikan keadilan kepada manusia yang ada di dalam wilayah-wilayah yang terekstraksi, tapi juga keadilan dalam konteks relasinya dengan more than human. Pertanyaan di chat kurang lebih seperti itu, bagaimana kira-kira kita bisa merespon existing legal framework, meskipun PP tadi udah mention bahwa mainstreaming ini ke isu legal selalu juga at the risk of something yang bisa membuat ini, dan itulah persis persoalan dalam membicarakan mengenai law and justice dalam isu extractivism. Dan tapi ada satu hal yang menarik karena ada respon dari Mbak Yohana Farida yang bicara mengenai climate initiative dan biodiversity offset. So it's not just about how people extract, but also how people restore one particular places, and what is the implication, how to restore, who get the benefit, who has the rights to do so. Jadi sepertinya pertanyaan bagaimana perspektif justice and multispecies justice ini dalam isu ekstraktif industri, tapi juga mungkin sepertinya kalau saya lihat pertanyaan Bu Yohana dan Mbak Mei Jebing, ya Mbak Mei Associate Fellow kita, bagaimana itu kemudian bisa kita masukkan juga dalam percakapan mengenai loss, damage, and mitigation dalam konteks imajinasi kita, memahami damage buat siapa, buat apa, atau siapa. So that's also the risk of, dan sekarang kita tahu hampir semua NGO konservasi mulai melirik how to engage with indigenous people because the fun and the grant said so. Jadi what do you think? Because this is on the other side of the extractive industry. Silakan Sophie. Masih di mute ya.
Makasih. Yeah, thank you so much, and Geir, for your spontaneous and incredibly well-structured commentary. And I'm really looking forward to knowing more about your research on nickel mining and reading your work also. Your response reminds me of, why I became an anthropologist, because you identify so many complexities and so many layers of tension and friction and interests and stakes, and our job as anthropologists, or I think anyway, is to stay with the trouble of that complexity, right? Even though sometimes it means that we know how to ask better questions about the world, but we don't always have helpful answers or practical answers. But maybe asking the better kinds of questions is already important. I think it's really interesting what you described about dependence, which is again another term which sometimes, relationality, can sometimes be a little bit romanticized in the multi-species scholarship, right? That we all live in multi-species dependence. We are all, dependent on the well-being of other beings. And of course, that's true on one level, but dependence can also be deeply disempowering. Dependence can be deeply extractive. Dependence can be deeply diminishing. So I think your commentary reminds me that dependence also, demands a contextual analysis rather than a kind of wholesale embrace. I think what you've offered is huge, and I think on your points about extraction, you might enjoy this new book I published, because there's only 3 chapters. The first one is all about extraction, not just extraction of resources, like nickel, for instance, but also the extraction of bodies from place to feed production systems like plantations, and also the extraction of labor from these human bodies and from the bodies of the plants that make plantations possible. So metabolic labor, if you wish. So it's trying to unpack the different facets of what extraction means for humans and non-humans. And I think your point about opportunities and desire and the horizons of hope that people who live in these extractive zones also hold and that animates their life is really important. What is the better life in these worlds or these environments of extraction? Who gets to decide? I didn't talk about it so much in this public lecture, but if you have a chance to come to the book launch on Friday about my new book, this one is very much about the challenge of writing as anthropologists about justice in ways that acknowledge more than human violence, but that also stays with the very, very heterogeneous and diverse and often conflicting ways that people themselves on the ground understand hope, understand what a good future is, and the kind of ethical challenges that come in trying to do justice to all of these different justices and injustices, I guess. So, yeah, maybe there will be more for that on Friday. Um, Human rights, yeah, yeah. I mean, I came to academia from a prior background in human rights advocacy, a lot of work on free, prior, informed consent, which was all, really, really important work. And, in some ways, I left the NGO world to do sort of academic work because I needed to, I felt like I needed to unpack some of the complexities of what is a right, for whom, how do we think about it in human and more than human terms, how do we think about FPIC, free, prior, informed consent, which I also did a lot of work on. What is the consent of an animal? How does a forest give consent? How does a cassowary give consent, right? Questions that there just wasn't, space to go there in the human rights work that I was doing because that was, there were other priorities and other urgencies and other stakes. But I still, there isn't a single day that I don't feel like I should be going back to human rights work because I think we need both, right? We need people who are working in the human rights space, working with FPIC, with international and national human rights framework, and we also need people who are doing rights of nature work, who are thinking about more than human jurisprudence, laws of, ecological rights and so forth. We need all of these different, like a multi-pronged approach to thinking about justice, and no single one is enough. Just like anthropology as a discipline is not enough to engage with all these questions, we need to be in dialogue with sociologists, with geographers, with critical race studies, with philosophers, with also with artists and academics and so forth, right? These are conversations that require all of these voices, and I think that's particularly important. On the point about conservation and restoration, is such a good point. What does it mean to, if we do in fact, as Anna Singh suggests, all inhabit blasted landscapes, what does repair mean? Who demands reckoning, right? Are we trying to go back to a kind of pristine before landscape, which probably never existed, right? Colonization and extraction have been here for a very long time. Are we, kidding ourselves by thinking that we can go back to a pristine past? Is that imaginary of a pristine past itself a colonial construct? I don't know, right? And these are big questions to ask ourselves. But I think when it comes to conservation, biodiversity conservation, particularly as the kind of other side to human rights, I suppose, in some ways. I think we need to. I think we need to start by questioning who is included as biodiversity, right? There's a number of questions on the chat about invasive species. I'm just noticing, and can there be justice when you're being asked to eradicate one organism in order to sustain another species, right? Can that ever be just? Biodiversity doesn't include all those species. Invasive species are not part of biodiversity. So there's already a kind of very strict delineation of who counts even as biodiverse. And I think maybe we need, and I know people are already doing this, but take a step back, slow down a bit, and start to question some of the assumptions and the premises about who gets to count as biodiversity, on what grounds, and what kind of justices or injustices that therefore legitimates or allows or naturalizes, if you wish, right? And I think, yeah, finally, yeah, Indigenous engagement. Yeah, it's such a huge question. It goes back to Pepe's comment earlier, the danger of kind of romanticizing or essentializing Indigenous ways of being in the world, given that these worlds have been profoundly damaged and reconfigured by racial colonial capitalism. I mean, I know that a lot of Indigenous scholars whom I work with, even in academia, they're chape, yeah, they're exhausted because everybody wants to hear from them because they are Indigenous and they sort of, hold the beacon of hope, but they're really tired because they are accountable to the communities in everyday life. They also have a responsibility in academia to speak for Indigenous resistance and resurgence. But that also means a huge amount of work and a huge amount of time and a huge amount of investment. And so I feel like, yeah, part of this research also teaches me to learn how to acknowledge and be in conversation with Indigenous scholars, but also respecting their own limited time, their own identity as very, very scarce resources, if you might allow me to use the language in this context, right? And how to get the balance right between wanting to be in dialogue, but also respecting people's ability to give and give and give, because these scholars are constantly be asked to give and give and give, often from a place of wanting to decolonize the field, but it's labor, right? It's a lot of work. So that's all I want to offer in closing, is the challenge of making these conversations meaningful and collective, whilst also recognizing that demanding participation can also be extractive.
Yes, exactly. Wow. Yeah, several questions on the chat box is already answered, I think, but there's several details. I think if we want to go move forward, Sophie, that would be interesting. And following your last discussions on, ya, membicarakan bagaimana siapa yang diberikan suara, siapa yang tidak diberikan suara, siapa yang dibiarkan hidup dan siapa yang tidak dibiarkan hidup dalam kerangka konservasi, dan sebetulnya bagaimana epistemic violence terjadi di dalam proses-proses itu semua. Ada beberapa concern di sini, ada dua saya lihat yang mungkin menarik untuk dilanjutkan. Saya nggak tahu apakah ini sudah terjawab, tapi sepertinya isu yang sama juga dikemukakan oleh Uti ya. Uti yang tim yang ikut riset saya juga. Uti, do you want to explain more on this? Ya, saya sebenarnya bicara mengenai bagaimana multispecies justice bisa bekerja di dalam konteks ketika killability dari setiap spesies berbeda. Apa Uti mau coba urun suara di sini untuk explain more, karena ada kaitannya juga dengan concern Mbak Yohana dan juga Mbak Mei dalam kaitannya dengan isu climate finance, biodiversity project dan lain-lain. Gimana mereka bersama state kemudian mengatur dan juga containing area untuk sebuah spesies tertentu. Uti mau respon, mau bicara, jelaskan lebih lanjut? Oh, atau dia sudah keluar? Oke, jika
Saya
dia belum,
cari pertanyaan di chat, tapi
ya,
karena banyak sekali ya.
Sastiviani Cantika, eh, dia sesudah AS Rosid. Oh, nggak bisa open mic. Mungkin minta tolong panitia untuk bisa meng-open mic untuk Mbak Uti. Atau saya bisa ya?
Oh, oke. Atau Imam bisa copy paste pertanyaan
Oke,
itu
bisa, bisa.
dalam chat, karena saya sudah cari di dalam chatnya.
Ya, because there is so many
Ya, ya, it's great, it's
questions,
great.
tapi
Ya,
akan saya
udah
coba.
bisa, Mas.
Oke,
Ya,
silakan Uti.
oke. Pakai bahasa Indonesia, bahasa Inggris ya.
Bebas,
Jadi,
eh, Sophie
Bebas.
bisa.
so since you mentioned about the killability and also already mentioned about the multi-species justice work as methodology, I just in my field work, I found that some beings, there are what is it, uneven distribution of care and the terms of killability itself. Some beings are protected, some are feared, some are sacrificed, some deaths become visible, and other losses such as livestock and things like that treated as ordinary or tolerable. So there are some, kalau Mas Imam tadi bilang pusparagam ya, some cases like human have to tolerate when they lost their livestock, when they lost even their life. But in some other cases, um, the wildlife in this terms is a tiger have to tolerate as well when their what is it, juvenile tiger have to be evacuated, separated with their mother, kind of like that. So, in terms of multi-species justice work as a methodology, in this kind of context, how can we use the multi-species justice to trace the uneven distribution of life, death, care, and also responsibility across the multi-species, human, wildlife, livestock, crops, and also the landscape itself, soil, tenure, and everything like that. And also conservation institution without turning justice into an abstract of moral category imposed from others.
Mhm.
Yeah, because you're also talking about what is it, a power relation in that. Ya, mungkin dari aku
Ya,
gitu, Mas Imam bisa nambahin.
bagaimana jika justice-nya diperdebatkan di
Ya,
lokasi ketika satu harimau mati? Apakah ya saya dengan Uti kemarin bertemu dengan orang yang memakamkan harimau dan berdebat apakah harus dikubur, dimakamkan atau dibawa otopsi. So who's
Mm.
justice? Ya,
Yeah,
silakan
yeah.
Sophie.
Wow. Thank you so much, Uti. That's such a great and provocative question, and I would love to know more about your fieldwork and your research on a separate occasion. I really wish that Rino was here because I think he could offer you some wisdom on using actor network theory to trace some of these networks of uneven care and killability. So, I think for me. As an ethnographer, my work is primarily centered on trying to, like you said, avoid the kind of moral high ground of, assuming or imposing certain, ideas or notions of killability and livability. And the best way to do that, in my experience, has been to actually try to unpack the different aspects to that uneven dimension of care and killability, or justice and injustice, I suppose, in some ways, from the who becomes an object of rightful care or killability, according to what sorts of cultural, ethical, or ecological principles and norms, traditional ecological knowledge, for instance. Also important is the why behind that uneven distribution, right? What is it that makes one species more meritorious of protection than another, and on what grounds, right? So the etiology or the teleology of care is really, really vital here. So because it connects with the why, right? And then another really important part of it for me is the how of killability. So often when we talk about killing and non-killing as binaries, we can sometimes forget that it's not just about whether or not an organism dies. It's also about how they die. So I'll give you an example. In Merauke, Marind, they hunt, they fish, they're engaged in killing all the time, right? To feed themselves. They also see themselves as becoming good food for others. So their blood feeds the mosquitoes, the leeches, their sweat nourishes like vegetation when they walk in the forest and come into contact. Sometimes people are attacked, and so people are also food for non-humans, which is a very different way of thinking about edibility, right? That the human too can become eaten. It's not always the one doing the eating. But then they will compare, for instance, when a cassowary is hunted and killed, there is all these rituals and songs and prayers that are recited to thank the cassowary for its life and for its kinship, to ask for forgiveness for the taking of the life to the cassowary families, and they will leave like food offerings for the kin of the cassowary. So there's a kind of sense of reciprocity. You're not just taking from the forest, you're also giving something back, even if it's a ritual or a prayer or something like this, right? A form of gratitude. The contrast is with roadkill. Yeah, the animals like a cassowary who might be crushed by a pommel, truck that is passing through the plantation, kills the cassowary. The cassowary maybe dies, maybe doesn't die, but it's wounded fatally, and it's alone. It's has no more pride. It has no dignity. It will not even become useful for people to eat because no one can eat an animal who has been killed this way. And animals who are killed in that way are deemed to be, it's deemed to be a great source of injustice, right? Unlike the cassowary who was killed to be hunted and eaten and to feed the human community. So the how of the killing is also an interesting angle to think about. What is not just a not just a good life and a good death, but what is just killing and an unjust death, right? So maybe that could be another interesting lens. And finally, I'd also say that sometimes, at least in my field work, people in the field, they often disagreed about what is multi-species justice, right? And they disagreed about what is a good death or a bad death. They disagreed about whether we should continue hunting when there's so many wildlife who are already on the verge of extinction because of oil palm expansion and deforestation. There was a big gendered dimension also to those disagreements within the villages. Many of the men, thinking back with Geger's question, we're keen to kind of move on, right? Oil palm is here to stay. So for us, justice is now about finding ways to work with the palm oil sector, finding jobs, creating employment opportunities, education. Sometimes the women had very different perspectives, right? What about the children? How do we feed the children? What about the sago grove? So for an anthropologist, often it's also interesting to look at the ways in which killability and care and justice is also something that it's not just us who are problematizing and critically thinking about, it's also the people in the field who are living in contexts of change and devastation and new forms of dependence, as Geger was saying, how they themselves are trying to grapple with these questions and the kind of frictions and generative tensions and disagreements that can arise as they too try to figure out what exactly do we mean by justice in this world, in this time, in the companionship of these species? Those are not going to answer any of the questions, but they're going to help to thicken the ethnographic landscape that you're working in and give to multi-species justice the kind of complexity and nuance and granularity that will precisely avoid going down a more abstract and moralizing framework. Because once you stay with that complexity, it's actually impossible to take an outside objective perspective, right? It's all about the complexity and the messiness, and I think that's what we need, right? It will not make for strong policy necessarily because it's very hard to hold on to that complexity in the world of policy, but I think it's still really, really important to hold on to that, so we avoid flattening power and avoid flattening justice to a single scalable kind of system. I hope that gives a little bit of answer to your great question, Uthi.
Thanks, Sophie. Ya, I think semua pertanyaan yang terdapat di atas saling cross-cutting. Jadi beberapa pertanyaan yang terdapat di chat, termasuk pertanyaan Uti, menjawab pula beberapa pertanyaan lain. So several questions already answered. There is one yang mungkin ingin jadikan juga sebagai penutup yang mungkin saya meminta izin. This is Irfan Nugraha, one of our new lecturer at department. Nah, sekarang dia meneliti mengenai solar energy di apa bendungan Cirata di Jawa Barat. Dia satu pertanyaan yang sepertinya bagus juga untuk dijadikan untuk menjadi pertanyaan penutup ke Sophie, tapi Irfan izinkan aku mereformulasi sedikit karena isunya berkenaan dengan about the survivability di tengah climate crisis dan dying and depleting environment ya. Jadi pertanyaan dia, kita bertahu bahwa there is a bleak visions of a future yang sering muncul di sini dan bagaimana kita bisa memikirkan ulang hal tersebut mengenai survivability, melihat itu dalam konteks multispecies justice. Dan saya ingat bahwa Sophie bersama Eben juga menulis The Promise ya, What is the Promise, dan Eben juga menulis mengenai hope. Mungkin in terms of bagaimana Irfan mengemukakan apa yang perlu kita bayangkan mengenai survivability dan bagaimana multispecies justice bicara mengenai itu. Mungkin saya ingin Sophie berbagi mengenai dua keyword ya, mengenai ya the promise of multispecies justice dalam konteks future and hope sebagai bagian penutup ini sebelum saya close. Silakan
Wow.
Sophie.
Wow. Terima kasih banyak, Irfan, atas pertanyaannya. That's such a great question. Indonesia is heading towards a future somewhere between Mad Max and Waterworld.
Ya.
Oh my goodness. I have this vision now in my head that is gonna I'm gonna have many nightmares tonight. So thank you, Irfan, for this. But you're right. I mean, um, there's an anthropologist called Jessica Greenberg, and she writes in one of her short pieces about justice that the opposite of justice is not injustice, but despair, right? So if we give up completely on the possibility of justice, then we will not live in a world of injustice, or not only injustice, but we will actually sink into despair, paralyzing politics of despair where we feel that nothing can be done and we are facing insurmountable crises and odds. And in some ways we are, right? This is a polycrisis, compounding the one with the other. I think for me, I'll say a number of things. The first is that with this project, hope was always there, right? At the same time as hope is a very slippery method. Yeah, it's a very yeah, it can promise different kinds of possibilities for the future, but it can also, it doesn't necessarily or always inject our thinking with action, right? Does theory give hope? I don't know. Does method give hope? I don't know. I think activism does for sure. I think we need to bring them into conversation the way that Suraya does in her work, for instance. But hope alone, maybe is not enough, right? So for me, the reason why we call the volume The Promise of Multi-Species Justice is because we do live in a world, as you say, where actually it's much more easy to identify injustice than justice, right? Can we think of an example of a just multi-species world? I don't know. Once I asked my marine friends, do you think the forest is a place of justice? And they were not sure, right? The forest is also a place where things are being killed and being eaten all the time, right? Soraya put a great point in the chat. Can we ever talk about justice killing? Who decides that? This is a question that I ask myself. It's also a question that my friends in the field ask myself. But the promise for me is a way of holding on to possibility, right? And to recognize that all of this thinking in academia about multi-species justice, it's happening in academic spaces, but actually it's also building on the work, on the action of activists and communities all around the world who are fighting for justice day in, day out, right? They're not theorizing it necessarily. They're not writing books necessarily. They're not publishing first quartile articles, but they're actually doing the work. Yeah. So we as academics are there to learn from these people doing this dirty, messy, dangerous work on the ground, and we cannot presume to be doing something new when in fact we are building on these long-standing genealogies. So for me, the promise is in those conversations with activists and practitioners without also idealizing what activism is or what advocacy is for or whom. Thinking carefully about who benefits from theorizing justice and enacting or fighting for justice in the everyday world and everyday life. In those kinds of conversations, I think there is possibility. And also, honestly, for me, Irfan is realizing that so many of the crises that we expect in the future, they are crises that have already happened for some people in the world, right? So there's an amazing article by Indigenous Native American scholar called Kyle White called Climate Injustice as Colonial Déjà Vu. And the whole article is about how climate change, it might be new for people like me in the global north, but actually indigenous peoples in America have been living with climate change since the first day of imperialization and colonization. What is new really depends on where you are, right? So we have a lot to learn from those déjà vus, from those precedents, and from the ways in which people around the world have dealt with crisis that we are seeing now or expecting on the horizon, but that are actually they're kind of a future anterior, right? They're a future that will already have been. So maybe that's one way of challenging also the past, present, future linearity through which we think about crisis, and learning from the futures that are actually already with us. And Pepe can speak to this better than I. She works on chemicals and toxicity. God knows if there's one space where we are living with the futures as a latent reality, it's through pesticides and toxic contaminations, right? The fact that our bodies now are already holding the futures of the worlds to come. So, sorry, that's a very not hopeful way to end. But I think the challenge is to learn to live with those realities, right? And to bring our crises into conversation, perhaps.
Thanks, Sophie. Really good one for ending the discussions. I think it's already 11 now. We can, of course, buat teman-teman di sini. Terima kasih sudah hadir. Terima kasih, Sophie. Terima kasih PP atas provoking banyak discussions and questions dan pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang ada di chat box ataupun yang masih ada di benak teman-teman tentu akan bisa ditindaklanjuti. Sophie's email is on her website and jadi kita bisa juga membantu jika ada yang ingin melanjutkan percakapan, dialog. Kita punya kanal dan platform to discuss that. Tapi saya juga ingin mengundang partisipan di sini untuk bersama kami di Departemen Antropologi untuk juga melanjutkan dan mendiskusikan, memfollow up hal-hal yang tadi telah Sophie sampaikan, a strong engagement between academics and advocacy, satu pihak yang membutuhkan move fast, respond swiftly dengan injustice dan lain-lain ya, tapi juga akademia yang memberikan sumber-sumber dan resource yang penting dan krusial untuk teman-teman advocate. So jadi sebuah interaksi yang mutual. Saya undang teman-teman di sini baik yang ada di NGO atau di advokasi untuk kita bisa bekerja sama ke depan, tapi juga mengundang banyak juga akademisi untuk mengkontekstualisasikan dan juga membuat dialog yang meaningful antara theoretical elaborations, paradigmatic reflections dengan advokasi dan juga NGO. Ada satu pertanyaan yang selalu muncul ketika kita bicara multispecies justice dan antropologi juga secara umum. Ini selalu menarik. Kita semua senang belajar antropologi, tapi apa hubungannya dengan policy? Jadi itu selalu ada demand itu. Tapi seperti yang Sophie sebutkan, kita harus punya imajinasi. Tidak apa-apa juga untuk berinteraksi dengan policy maker dan berinteraksi. Semua yang Sophie sampaikan di sini pasti ada relevansinya. Tapi respon PP terhadap itu dan respon Sophie atas respon PP mengenai betapa pentingnya kita memperhatikan dan berhati-hati mengenai institutionalizing justice dan berfokus pada law dan juga berfokus pada stories. Dan rasanya ke depan apa yang telah dilakukan Sophie melalui eksplorasi seni dan lain-lain seperti disebutkan oleh kolega kita juga di departemen Aryo Danusiri itu juga penting ke depan dalam membuka ruang imajinasi itu. Saya undang teman-teman yang ada di sini yang baru berkenalan dengan kami untuk membangun persahabatan dan persaudaraan dalam konteks membangun apa yang sudah dieksplor mengenai krisis ekologi, uraian Sophie mengenai krisis ekologi dan interaksinya dengan departemen kami. Saya pikir saya tutup. I will close the session. Terima kasih banyak Sophie, terima kasih banyak PP, teman-teman yang sudah bertanya. Christine dan teman-teman lain, saya diingatkan oleh Christine, OC dari event Sophie 3 hari ke depan untuk menghadiri book talk hari Jumat. Tadi Sophie sudah sebutkan, hari Jumat jam 9 hibrid. Sophie akan online, tapi diskusan kita akan hadir di sini. Termasuk di sini sudah ada sebetulnya Prof. Bambang dan tadi aku lihat Mbak Yulia juga join dan Mbak Sari. Nanti akan ada diskusi lebih lanjut, menarik lagi, eksplorasi lebih lanjut mengenai hal yang sudah kita bicarakan hari ini. Mungkin sekian public talk ini. Terima kasih semua. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang buat semua. Thanks.
Selamat
Thank
siang,
you so
terima
much, Pak
kasih
Iman.
semuanya.